This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is December 12th, 2020. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone.
We have three interesting segments for you today. If you've been listening recently, you'll know that Darren has been doing a lot of reading. He gives us another roundup of what books have been making it onto his bookshelf. And Cristina, you're going to talk to us about the 12 Days of Christmas and whether it's a code. But first, we throw it to Adam, who gives us a segment about Brussels sprouts.
What's up, cuboids? Brussels sprouts. They're terrible, right? What do you think of when you think about Brussels sprouts? As a child of the 80s, these were, to me, synonymous with terrible food. Children in sitcoms and cartoons would complain that they had to eat Brussels sprouts, the most disgusting possible thing you could eat. Myself, I never ate them. My father once confessed that Brussels sprouts were the worst tasting food, which is likely why we never had any in my home growing up. Can't blame my parents for never buying any. Why buy, cook, and serve a vegetable that is terrible when there are alternatives that are not terrible? I mean, sure, I was often made to eat foods which I didn't like. This includes all kinds of fish, but this was mostly due to my own personal taste rather than fish being some universally considered to be terrible food. As an adult, I quite enjoy certain fish like salmon, trout, or tuna, but I never really got around to liking white fish, I guess. Some things don't change, but some things do. So, Brussels sprouts are terrible? In the 1960s, an episode of the TV show Leave It to Beaver, titled Beaver Won't Eat, centered around the main character, the beaver, refusing to eat his Brussels sprouts. Fast forward many years, and over the last few years, I have had Brussels sprouts. I had them cooked with bacon and in bacon fat, and they seemed pretty good. But one doesn't need to like onions to like onion rings or enjoy zucchini to enjoy a fried zucchini stick. Perhaps, like a French fry being a vehicle for ketchup, this Brussels sprout recipe was just a way to eat bacon and convince oneself that they're eating healthy. Well, as a lazy person, I often steam my vegetables, and one day I simply steamed some Brussels sprouts instead of preparing them elaborately in some bacon grease and putting a bunch of stuff in them. And they were not great, but they weren't terrible. They had a sharp taste, but they were certainly no worse than cabbage or spinach or some other vegetable, which I eat and somewhat enjoy. I'd eat a bowl full of Brussels sprouts to avoid eating a single bite of turnip, for example. I prepared these very simply, so it wasn't that back in the day no one knew how to cook them. I think people usually boil them in movies and sitcoms and shows where they would make fun of them. All these TV shows would have me believe that Brussels sprouts tasted as terrible as something like kale, but here we are, not that bad. So was I lied to all my life? Some people say, oh, well, kids are told that Brussels sprouts are bad, so they just kind of propagate this idea, which is nonsense. Brussels sprouts are known for having a very strong, bitter taste. I suppose I can see it, but the taste doesn't really seem to match the fuss. But there's a simple explanation for all of this. Brussels sprouts changed. The ones we eat today are less terrible than what the beaver refused to eat in the 1960s. The quest to make Brussels sprouts less horrible started in the 90s. Dutch scientist Hans van Doer isolated the compound in Brussels sprouts, called spridges in the Netherlands, that gave it that specific taste. Companies then proceeded to go through old seed banks to look for possible strains of Brussels sprouts which had less of that specific chemical. So they did this the old-fashioned way by growing them in test plots and finding which ones didn't have that chemical. The less horrible-tasting ones were then cross-pollinated with modern crops, because modern crops of Brussels sprouts, like many other modern crops, had higher yield. So basically you can have Brussels sprouts that don't have that terrible taste, but are higher yield like a modern crop. Great. Now, these varieties of Brussels sprouts took off in popularity in restaurants in the US. Brussels sprouts are now selling much more than they used to, with farmers getting 4 to 5 times more money for their crops than they used to even 10 years ago. Now, inflation alone can't account for that. And the amount of Brussels sprouts planted in the US has also increased from 2,500 acres a few years ago to 10,000 acres as of last year. Pretty impressive. Now, it should be mentioned that any crop which humans grow has changed considerably since the start of agriculture, both through selective breeding and genetic modification. As such, the varieties we eat today are likely better in many ways when measured by taste, size, and crop yield than the ones our ancestors used to have. Now there's a bit of a niche market for trying to eat sort of older strains of food and all sorts of things like that. In this case specifically, however, there was a concerted effort to identify a source of the bad taste and find varieties which didn't have it, which really did change things for this food. A little side fact, they're called Brussels sprouts, not Brussels sprouts. They're named after Brussels, Belgium, so anyone who's familiar with that city might instinctively call it that. But I wrote this wrong a grand total of 18 times in my segment before asking myself why the word was repeatedly being underlined and flagged. Guess I was wrong on that. Brussels sprouts aren't quite as bad as they used to be. Unfortunately, I can't give you a good comparison since I never ate them as a child. Maybe you can, and maybe you did. So how long will it take before this food loses its once well-deserved but no longer accurate reputation as a terrible food? Will future generations be puzzled when they see the beavers' reaction to this food? Well, we can only hope that in the future, this show will still have the popularity of, well, Brussels sprouts. Peace out, cuboids.
All right, Cristina, is the 12 Days of Christmas song some sort of a code?
Okay, checkers, let's gather around the fireplace now, and I'll tell you a little tale about an old Christmas carol. I first caught wind of this in Snopes ages ago when I was looking for a Christmas-themed segment. The original post was the song The 12 Days of Christmas created as a secret code by persecuted Catholics, written by David Mickelson, was published in December 2000. He does a great historical deep dive on the song's origins. Like, he really, really does. He gets into a lot of the religious history. Now, I was pondering covering it this year, and then I came across a Vox article from December 1st by Tanya Pai titled The 12 Days of Christmas, the story behind the holiday's most annoying carol. She too digs into the myth that the song is a secret Christian code, but also gives some great context and background on the song. So here we go. When does the period famously known as the 12 Days of Christmas happen? Pat, do you know?
I don't. I suppose if I was to make a wild guess, I would say the 12 days leading up to the first of the new year.
Okay, it's a good guess. I used to assume it was the 12 days leading up to and ending with Christmas Day. Okay. Because let's face it, as a kid, the anticipation and excitement, it's all over by the 25th. So I guess that was my pre-Google days logic, that everything was leading up to that day. Now, as many of you know, the 12 Days of Christmas actually begins on December 25th, and it runs until January 6th. In Christian theology, this is the time span between Christ's birth and the three wise men's visit. Now, as Pai points out, the carol's history is kind of murky. Some historians believe its origin is French. The earliest version of the lyrics date back to a 1780 children's book called Mirth Without Mischief. Now, Pai mentions that this book, a first edition of it, sold for over $23,000 at a Sotheby's auction in 2014. Wow. Writer Jack Wheeler suggests that kids in 18th century England learned the game from French kids who had been dropping those rhymes since 1625. Their version was called In Those 12 Days. And Wheeler posits, quote, "We know the song was originally French, as for example, partridges were introduced into England from France in the 1770s. Okay, I did do a side goog to try and corroborate this. Wildlife Trust's sites, amongst others, also known as the French partridge, the red-legged partridge was introduced to the UK from Western Europe during the 1700s as a new game bird." Cool. Now, it seems there is general agreement, though, that the song is a memory and forfeits game, typically played by children. Or I guess it's based on a memory and forfeits game. One person, the leader, recites a verse, another repeats it, and then the leader keeps adding verses until someone's memory lapses. The loser has to forfeit a piece of candy or whatever was agreed upon as the forfeit. There also have been various lyrics at different times through history, according to Pai. As an example, an early version of the lyric, "For calling birds," was written for collie birds, which is an old-timey expression for black as coal, so really for blackbirds. Now, today the carol we know and love, or hate, comes from English composer Frederick Austin, who changed collie to calling, set the melody, and put his own twist on how the lyric 5 go old rings is sung. Now, if you've never seen it, UK comedian Eddie Izzard does such a funny take on this carol. I'll see if I can find that sketch on YouTube, and I'll throw it in the show notes.
It's hilarious.
Basically, the song is a big brag about the gift someone's true love gave them. It kicks off on the first day of Christmas, my true love sent to me, a partridge in a pear tree. Then continues, on the second day of Christmas, my true love sent to me 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree. You guys get the picture. You keep adding a gift for each day, repeating and building on each verse until you get to the climactic final and a partridge in a pear tree. Quickly, the rest of the gifts are day 3, 3 French hens. Day 4, 4 calling birds. Day 5, 5 gold rings. Day 6, 6 geese a-laying. Day 7, 7 swans a-swimming. Day 8, 8 maids a-milking. Day 9, 9 ladies dancing. Day 10, 10 lords a-leaping. Day 11, 11 pipers piping. Day 12, 12 drummers drumming. And that brings us to Christianity. That's an Eddie Izzard segue if I've ever heard one. Hey, Pat? Mm-hmm. As I mentioned off the top, there's been a long-standing theory that the carol has coded references to Christianity. As Pye points out, the song is thought to have been written to help Christians learn and pass on the tenets of their faith while avoiding persecution. Now, Snopes breaks down what the coded references are according to this myth. And it's interesting, a lot of the articles that I did see do point back to the Snopes article. The partridge in the pear tree is Jesus Christ. 2 turtle doves, the Old and New Testaments. 3 French hens, faith, hope, and charity, the theological virtues. 4 calling birds, the 4 Gospels and or the 4 evangelists. 5 golden rings, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, which gives the history of man's fall from grace. 6 geese a-laying, the 6 days of creation. 7 swans, the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, the 7 sacraments. 8 maids a-milking, the 8 beatitudes. 9 ladies, the 9 fruits of the Holy Spirit. 10 lords, the 10 commandments. 11 pipers, the 11 faithful apostles. 12 drummers, the 12 points of doctrine in the Apostles' Creed. Yes, I did shorten the lyrics a little bit for the sake of time. Now, this is exactly the type of thing that you can see people sharing around socials, isn't it? As Snow points out, though, and Pye, there are a few holes in its logic. Mickelson says, quote, 2 very large red flags indicate that the claim about the secret origins of the song The 12 Days of Christmas is nothing more than a fanciful tale similar to the many apocryphal hidden meanings of various nursery rhymes. Now, there is absolutely no documentation or supporting evidence for this claim whatsoever. Other than mere repetition of the claim itself, the claim appears to date only to the 1990s, making it as likely an invention of modern-day speculation rather than historical fact. Now, as Pye says, the lyrics in the song aren't really a great tool for remembering the actual key pillars of faith, actually. And those points include belief in God the Father, Jesus Christ as the Son of God and the Holy Spirit, the death, descent into hell, resurrection and ascension of Christ, the holiness of the church, and the communion of saints. Thank you, Wikipedia. And if Christians were being persecuted from practicing their faith, that they had to hide a code in a song, would they even be allowed to celebrate Christmas, let alone sing about it?
So this is what I'm thinking is like, it's hidden in a Christmas song? All things.
I know.
So, okay.
Now, Pye cites late historian William Studwell, who is famously known as a Christmas carol expert. He totally refuted the notion of a coded song. Here's his quote he originally made to the Religion News Service in 2008. This was not originally a Catholic song. No matter what you hear on the internet, neutral reference books say this is nonsense. If there was such a catechism device, a secret code, it was derived from the original secular song. It's a derivative, not the source. And there you have it.
Interesting. I think that's the most we've talked about religion on the show since the Shroud of Turin segment.
True.
Thanks, Cristina. And with that, we'll hand the end of the show over to Darren. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
Yes, please stay safe, stay classy, and not smart-assy.
I've still been reading a lot of books, listeners, so here's a little roundup. First, The Ethics of Influence, Government in the Age of Behavioral Science by Cass R. Sunstein. So this book explores the ethical issues surrounding government nudges, choice architecture and mandates, while discussing autonomy, dignity, welfare, and manipulation. It's a sufficient treatment of the subject, best intended for policy wonks or economists or social scientists, as others might find it a bit dry. Sunstein knows his stuff and is good at communicating the various ideas at play, backed up by research and reasonable ethical stances. In terms of main takeaways, I'll share the summary at the end of Chapter 6. He kind of did it for me. Number 1, there's widespread cross-national support for nudges of the type democratic governments have adopted. Number 2, support for nudges diminishes when people distrust the motivations of the choice architects or when people fear inertia and inattention might lead to outcomes not aligned with their interests. Number 3, greater support for System 2 nudges, which are more deliberative, than System 1 nudges, which are more automatic, exists, although there can be support for the latter when addiction is involved. Number 4, people's assessments of nudges in general can be greatly affected by political valence of the particular nudges that they have in mind, if they think it seems to be aligned with one more political party or another, or one more political end. And number 5, transparency about nudging should not, in general, reduce the effectiveness of nudges because most nudges are already transparent. Transparency is generally the way to go. So it is also possible to have a greater uptake under a free or forced choice model compared to a default option, which I thought was interesting because we usually hear once you change the default option, that's what improves everything, especially say with organ donation. And there are other examples where if you give people choice, it actually results in more results that you want. That's the ethics of influence. Next, I'm going to briefly discuss The Science of Evil by Simon Baron Cohen.
Interesting.
Science of Evil on Empathy and the Origins of Cruelty, as a subtitle, is a short exploration of empathy that focuses on the clinical psychological dimension. So you have borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, narcissism, autism spectrum disorder. He briefly discusses some absolutely horrible things humans have done, like Nazis cutting off people's hands, reversing them on the arms and sewing them back on. Yeah. But the vast majority of the book is about empathy, why it is important, how some people have little or none of it, why it matters. It's a kind and intelligent book. He thinks the work contributes 10 important ideas. This was written in 2011, by the way. Number 1, we all lie on an empathy spectrum.
So we all pretend to be more empathetic?
No, sorry. We are all placed.
Oh, lie.
Yeah, that's funny. It was good to clarify. That's a good point. What are you thinking? Number 2, one end is 0 degrees, and you can have a 0 positive or 0 negative, depending on whether 0 is good or bad. Okay. All forms of 0 degrees of empathy are related to personality disorders. This is what I would say is his main insight. Is empathy, or lack thereof, a useful way to categorize various personality disorders? That's the question he kind of asks, and that's what he thinks is a useful answer. Number 3, the brain circuit will be atypical in those with 0 degrees of empathy. Number 4, treatment should target the empathy circuit in the brain. Number 5, early secure attachment is an internal pot of gold that a person can draw upon throughout their life. Meaning, if you have a secure attachment with your caregivers, especially your primary caregiver, you will have a better life outcome in general. Sure. And you can use that as a buffer against other issues you may experience in your life. Number 6, there are genes, of course, after many intermediate steps, for empathy. I don't think we're too surprised by that. Number 7, some 0 degrees of empathy have a positive side. The systematizing abilities of people with Asperger's syndrome, for example. Number 8, systematizers are often stepping outside of time. And so here it's just the idea that things are very, very much scheduled in a certain way. And as we know, in certain conditions, surprises or anything violating expectancy are not appropriate. And so time is processed a bit differently than it might be in, say, neurotypicals. Number 9, those with autism or Asperger's find change toxic. That's actually the word that he uses. Number 10, empathy is the most valuable resource in our world.
Wow.
Yet, it's not formally taught in school, not mentioned in business and or any policies. So he's obviously pushing the empathy. Obviously, big empathy got to him. So I thought this was a decent overview, but neither a historical nor social nor comprehensive treatment. It is focused on the psychiatric or psychological domain. And it's definitely not as funny as his Borat stuff. Now, just in case, that's his cousin. So I think it's funny, but just in case. I don't want
to... Are they actually related?
Yeah, it's his cousin.
Oh,
yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. All right, what's next? Well, The Quest for Cosmic Justice by Thomas Sowell.
Okay.
A decent work where Sowell does his usual thing by challenging mainstream opinions by using a conservative or libertarian bent, often, but not always, supported by evidence and reason. The main point of this work is that societies are complicated and people have unequal abilities and dispositions, and it should not be the role of government to make everything equal.
Sure.
Sowell believes this on philosophical grounds, but also on practical ones. Now, I'd heard before that various individuals go in and out of various different income quintiles.
Sure.
So it is incorrect to think that the bottom 20% is always consisting of the same people.
Yeah, I think Pinker illustrated that a lot of people actually go through many different
Correct.
Levels of wealth throughout their lives just because they acquire
Right.
as they age, right?
Correct. They may not go from like the bottom to the top as much, but they do go in and out of those different quintiles.
Yeah.
In this book, Sowell says that those who stay in the bottom quintile for at least 8 years are only 3% of the U.S. population.
Okay.
Similarly, the consistent rich are also only 3 to 4%. Thus, many people are thinking about things in the wrong way when they think about the poor and the rich. And I think that's useful. That in another way, there will always be a bottom quintile. Like we need to get this bottom 20%. Like, but there's still, okay, yes, we want to improve outcomes for people, but there's still going to be a bottom 20%.
Well, this kind of comes to the idea of, do you want to reduce inequality or do you want to reduce poverty? What do you ultimately want to do? You want people.
That's a different book, Adam.
Oh, okay. Right.
Now, although this book is about 25 years old, it's interesting, sad maybe, to see issues of race and the income pay gap still being discussed in ways that are similar to the present.
Yeah.
I'm more recently attuned to this discussion, but obviously other people have been at this for decades. Disparity is not automatically evidence of discrimination versus yes, it is. This seems to be the main way of looking at this discussion, and he's commenting on that being a problem before, and I think it's a problem now.
My personal belief is not all disparity is due to discrimination, but discrimination still does exist. So we should always seek to
Correct.
reduce.
I think the best way is that it is one of the hypotheses. It is likely doing some of the explanatory so-called work when there is any disparity. But I think that my issue is just only when people assume it is totally and only discrimination that leads to disparity. I thought his coverage was one-sided at times, in particular regarding nuclear non-proliferation versus nuclear proliferation. He was also writing some of the stuff in the 80s, so it was a bit more of a hot topic. The idea is that proliferation can actually help deterrence, meaning that if you're trying to stop a war, showing that you have more weapons, people are less likely to attack you.
Sure.
And it's not obvious that that's actually wrong compared to just trying to reduce your weapons, which is less likely to cause a war. Now, that said, he made no mention of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost doomed the entire Earth, which I was like, well, to be fair, maybe that's a data point, which the costs are everything. So I thought that wasn't as well covered. That said, in another section, I found value in Sowell challenging the very word redistribution as false because income was not distributed in the first place. People worked for it and earned it. This just goes to this is how libertarian people tend to think, right? Like, well, I made money. Yeah. Now it is being distributed. It's not being redistributed. Yeah, now, someone else would say, well, but your station in life caused you to receive money in a certain way, even though you worked for it, which is you getting the money. My point is, it's just useful for me to think that this is how other people think about this issue.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to look at the question. For sure.
Yeah. That said, if you're looking to read about these types of things, I would suggest trying his Economics, Facts, and Fallacies first.
Okay.
Then a quick one here is What Algorithms Want by Ed Finn. It's quick because I got very little from it, and I think most people could just watch the documentary The Social Dilemma to get the main argument. The author tackles the ever-increasing algorithmic influence on our society with a literary approach, but the content covered was already too familiar to me and thus yielded few, if any, insights. And then finally, Is This Anything by Jerry Seinfeld. So this is not about critical thinking, obviously, but I happened to finish this one and I thought I'd mention it's a nice collection for fans. Nothing really new as it's just his material over the past 5 decades, but unless you've memorized 6 hours of his comedic bits, you might appreciate it.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.